Well, thank you all very much for being here. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I am originally from Rockford, Illinois. I came to IU as a student in 1987. Before the ADA, I got my undergrad here. I went home to work for my local hometown park district right after the ADA was passed. And if you know number 28 on your job description, other duties as assigned, that's how I became the ADA coordinator. This was way back before the internet. So I learned everything by calling my resources and getting the pages of the ADA faxed to me as I needed them. So whether or not it was about restrooms and grab bars or entrances or parking lots, I eventually was able to piecemeal it all together. Two of the resources that I called very often in my career at my park district was the Great Lakes ADA Center, which is one of 10 regional centers throughout the United States, and they provide technical assistance. You can call them anytime, Monday through Friday, and ask them any type of question, whether or not it's employment related or about the standards or the regulations, and they will answer your question. The other one I connected with was the National Center on Accessibility, which was here at IU. And I spent 17 years at the National Center on Accessibility and had a 2-year stint as the associate director up at the Great Lakes ADA Center. And as Vicki mentioned, in the last 2 years, I've kind of branched out to start my own consulting business. I have a website and a Facebook page you can go to. It's called Accessibility Management News. We have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. But what I like to do is talk about compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, very similar to the approach that you do with safety and risk management. And I'm using the term accessibility management. It's not one of those things that you can flip a switch and be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Just like safety, it requires a lot of education, training, and knowing who your resources are in order to make those corrective actions and make sure that you're inclusive and welcoming of people with disabilities. So when I was asked to come down here, I live in Fishers, so I made that 70-mile drive this morning in the nice rain. But when I was asked, Vicki and Michael said, yeah, can you keep it to 40 minutes? Like, yeah, okay, I talk fast, but not that fast. And typically when I do training and talk about the accessibility standards, usually that's like a 40-hour course. I actually just did training for Cleveland Metro Parks, and I'm getting ready to do the same thing for the city of Minneapolis, and it's way longer than 40 minutes. So I cannot tell you everything there is to possibly know about complying with the ADA in 40 minutes. I'm going to give you enough information to be dangerous, to go out there and to know who your resources are so that when the issues come up, you know who to tap into to get the most current, correct, accurate, available information. And hopefully this is also an opportunity to spark some thought for you in terms of how is your venue, your restaurant accessible to people with disabilities, what barriers might still exist, and what kind of action plan that you could put in place in terms of being more accessible and welcoming to visitors with disabilities. So just a kind of refresher in terms of your restaurant. You fall under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you recall, you're having any previous training on the ADA. Title I deals with employment. Title II deals with state and local government. Title III is basically public accommodations that or private businesses that open up their doors to servicing the public. You provide goods and services, programs or activities. Your requirement is that you make reasonable modifications to your policies and procedures to ensure that people with disabilities can get your services or partake in any type of the offerings that you give to the general public. What that means is a reasonable modification. Reasonable is a real legal term of art. It's very subjective. It's left up to the courts to decide. What might be reasonable for one company might not necessarily be reasonable for another. So there is a subjective element to it, but essentially if you have policies or procedures in place that might either intentionally or unintentionally screen out people with disabilities, you're required to modify those policies. The most often given example of that is our no pets policy. For years and years and years, all of our businesses had little stickers in the front door that said, no pets. So a reasonable modification there would be that you would modify your policy to enable people that use service animals, people with disabilities using a service animal, to come in and use your business. That would be one way that you could modify it. Another way might be changing a rule, or allowing somebody to bring a personal care assistant, or maybe if there were a party coming into your restaurant and somebody had food allergies and they've gone through the entire menu and couldn't quite find something, you would modify your policy to let that individual bring an auxiliary item in the event, in that large party. Your menu might not necessarily accommodate them. So those are a couple different ways. Also, your other requirements are you need to communicate, provide effective communication. Whatever communication that you do with the general public has to be as effective for people with disabilities as it is for people without disabilities. Oftentimes we'll see this example with our menus. Our menus traditionally are in print. That might not necessarily be effective for people that are visually impaired or blind or have learning disabilities. So we would look at what are the other alternative formats that we could provide, maybe large print, braille, pictorial menus, and so forth. So those are kind of some of the policy procedure ways that you can look at and should seek more information in terms of making your services accessible to people with disabilities. The other big question that we always get when it comes to existing facilities is, what about, how do we address existing facilities? And there's this huge answer that we often get. One of the most popular answers when we talk to businesses is that they'll say, oh, we're grandfathered. We don't have to use that. We don't have to make our building accessible. We don't have to make our storefront accessible because we're grandfathered into the ADA. So I'm asking this question to you is, what does the grandfather clause and unicorns have in common? The grandfather clause in the ADA and unicorns have in common? I heard somebody say it.
They don't exist.
They don't exist. They don't exist in the ADA. So if you start to work with people, those of you that are advocates in the community, we want to make sure that restaurants and building owners understand that there is no grandfather clause in the ADA, is that there are actually proactive requirements that businesses had to take. That proactive requirement is that you do what is called readily achievable barrier removal. Yet another legal term that is a legal term of art. Basically the way that translates is that it's easily accomplished without much difficulty or expense. But for you in Title III, this was a proactive requirement. It's not a one-time thing either. It's an ongoing requirement until your existing facility is accessible and can fully serve people with disabilities. So there are some examples that the Department of Justice gave in the Title III regulations about what readily achievable might be for private businesses. It could be providing an accessible route from the parking lot to the entrance, installing an entrance ramp, widening a door, installing accessible door hardware, repositioning shelves. It might even mean moving tables or chairs or display racks and other furniture to create an accessible route within the venue or within the facility. This is an ongoing requirement. So if you've made your parking accessible and your entrance accessible, but your restroom is still not accessible, I'll tell you right now, my family cannot go to a restaurant. We cannot eat out without every single member in that hour and 15 minutes that we're there using the restroom. And a lot of people will say, well, you're not at the venue long enough for the restroom to really be made accessible. Oh, no. You have not met my 11-year-old son that's going to drink 5 gallons of lemonade at that table before we've even ordered. So you really need to think about how people are coming in and using your services, how they're participating in terms of what those priority issues or corrective actions you might be working with. Any questions about readily achievable barrier removal? Not a one-time thing. You're laughing, and I know why. I know all about you. You just don't know yet. No, I'm kidding. So readily achievable, proactive, ongoing. Because it's a legal term of art, it's different for each building or public accommodation. What is readily achievable for your McDonald's or your Applebee's might not necessarily be readily achievable for your mom and pop restaurant or bookstore on the corner. They're very different legal tests. In essence, if a complaint were filed against the business, if it were investigated or if it went to court, those investigators or the judge would look at what are the resources available to that entity in terms of whether or not that would be readily achievable. Generally, it's not an argument that I would encourage one of my clients to use that to say, well, it's just not readily achievable. When I work with clients, my goal is for them to understand that people with disabilities, at least 20% of our population have a disability. That easily translates to their family members and friends, especially when they're going out, recreating, eating out, going to the movies. You're not just talking about that one $12 menu item that one person with a disability might be ordering. You're talking about a whole party of 5 or 6 that might end up being $100, $150 check at the end of their visit. So it really translates in terms of disposable income, not just that people with disabilities have, but that their family members and friends have too. So when I'm working with clients, I want them to understand that by servicing people with disabilities, it's actually generating more business. And you know what happens with with your business is that the best marketing that you can have is by word of mouth. When word gets out that you've made your venue accessible to people, it's just going to turn over, and more people with disabilities are going to want to visit there and partake in the offerings that you have.
That term, readily accessible, used to bring to my head day and night. I used to even dream the word.
Yeah, it's hard to get it. Yeah, that's right. So the Department of Justice actually recommends that you look at barrier removal in terms of priorities. That first priority that they encourage is that you're looking at your parking and your exterior route and your entrance into the building. So, have those been addressed? Are there any issues there? Secondly, they're looking at the areas where goods and services are provided. In a movie theater, we're not just talking about getting into the door. We're talking about getting into the theater itself and being able to enjoy the movie or enjoy the event that is taking place there. The same thing in a restaurant. We're looking at actually getting into the dining room or getting into the party room or getting into those VIP sections of the bar or what have you, and being able to access those goods and services. That third priority is restrooms, and then the fourth one is any other amenities that might be served. So if I were talking about a hotel, I'm looking at parking, entrance, and then I'm looking at making sure that I have the required number of accessible hotel rooms, making sure that the toilet rooms serving the hotel rooms are accessible and those common restrooms are accessible. Then I'd start looking at the other amenities, like if they're offering a fitness center or a swimming pool there and making those accessible, but lower on down the priority list. So if you don't have them, the website where you can access them, the Americans with Disabilities Act standards for accessible design, they were released originally in 1991 and they were updated in 2010. They're on the Access Board website. It's access-board.gov. The Access Board has been working in the last 2 years to provide updated graphics and technical guidance information to understand the standards better. So they have some new illustrations for parking and for restrooms, and it just translates the standards better for us to understand how a person that's using a wheelchair might use a certain space, approach a door, or use a toilet room, and how we can get that information and kind of look at how that matches up with our existing facility. If you have done any renovation since the ADA was passed up until 2010 or actually 2011, if you've done any renovation and used the old standards and complied with the old standards, there's a clause in the 2010 standards that talks about safe harbor. And if you've complied with the original 1991 standards, you're good to go. The release of these 2010 standards does not mean that you need to go back and fix them to bring things up into compliance. The best example there is reach ranges. The original maximum height for reach ranges was 54 inches in the 1991 standards. The new standards in 2010 brought that reach range from 54 inches down to 48 inches. If I've gone through and fixed all my light fixtures or my thermostats so they're down at 54 inches, I don't have to go touch them again to bring them down to 48 inches unless I was doing something else to them already. Maybe I was changing out the control itself. I'd want to lower it then, but it doesn't mean that you have to retroactively go back and fix things that were compliant with the old standards. But you need to know that the new standards exist. Yet again, I'm going to say that I'm going to talk really fast, but there's just no way I can get you to memorize all of the dimensions here. And the great thing about this is that the CCA has this survey form. They have it available. You could get it from their website, and you could informally use it to go through your facility to see how that matches up before maybe you want to call them to come out and visit and talk through what some of the issues that you might still see exist. So generally for parking, there's a requirement for accessible parking spaces. It's based on the total number of spaces that you have in your parking lot. There's a requirement for a car accessible space and for a van accessible space. There's also a requirement for the signage. So definitely if you're in the process of resurfacing your parking lot or restriping your parking lot, you'll want to have the standards, make sure that your contractor has the standards and are using the most current available information. If you don't have a parking lot, because I know there's a lot of you that don't because they are in Bloomington, not like in Fishers where we just have spread out all over the farmland there. So let's say you don't have a parking lot, but you're on a city street. You should be working with the city to address where the closest accessible parking spaces are to make sure that they're on an accessible route. If you don't have one, that's definitely an option to be working with and asking for. We have a lot of business owners that don't realize that that is an option for them to make that type of request to designate an accessible parking space. If you do have an accessible parking space on a city block or that, make sure and put that information available on your website so people know where the closest accessible parking is. That would be very helpful for them.
Jennifer, everybody has a packet, and in there, there's some written information about accessible parking.
Excellent.
And there's also the checklist in there too.
Great. So this is an example here from the new technical guide from the Access Board. In addition to parking, you need to have an accessible route. This would be the exterior route that goes to your entrance, and then the accessible route throughout your venue. It includes technical requirements for walking surfaces, doorways, ramps, curb ramps, elevators, limited use elevators, and platform lifts. Some of the requirements there that wherever you have an accessible route, it should not exceed a slope greater than 1 in 20. Generally, that equates to about 5%. That your accessible route has a cross slope no greater than 1 in 48, which is about 2%, a little bit more than 2%. That your accessible route is at least 36 inches wide. It can reduce, but where it does, after it does, you need to have clear floor space, turning space, and passing space as well. It also addresses protruding objects and overhead clearances. I think I'm already way over my times. So other things with your accessible routes, if you have ramps, they cannot exceed a slope of 1 in 12. That's roughly 8%. There's a maximum requirement for the rise, the length, and it also triggers requirements for handrails, landings, and edge protection. Because you have an existing facility, there's a couple places that would allow you to have a slope steeper than 8%. You could actually go up to 10%, but only for a very limited space. So you should know that that is an option if you have issues within your venue. There's requirements for elevators, for call signals, for tactile buttons, for two-way communication. Other requirements for doors and doorways, the minimum width being 32 inches, maneuvering space, space for the approach, whether or not you're on the push or the pull slide. The one issue here that I want to make sure that you're aware of is that for interior doors, there is a requirement for the force of the door not being more than 5 pounds. This doesn't necessarily translate very well to exterior doors because we have heavier doors that for life safety, fire, and so forth are purposed to be heavier. That doesn't mean that it precludes you or excludes you from having an accessible route. So one way to create that accessible route on your exterior doors, most likely 9 times out of 10, is going to be providing some type of automatic door system. So if you've been surveyed or you're going to have somebody come out and do a survey, that's definitely a conversation that you'll want to have, because that weight, when we talk about exterior doors, once we're up at 10, 12, 15 pounds to open a door, it's just really too heavy for people with limited mobility or limited strength to open independently. But something definitely to consider. Service counters, there's a requirement for sections of your service counter to be lower at an accessible height. Those would also address any areas where you might have food service tray slides. Condiment stations, my absolutely favorite place to complain about is, well, I won't say about the Bloomington one because I haven't been there for a while, the Paradise Cafe, the Panera Bread. Where your condiment stations are, if they're too far of a reach range or have to go back too far, those need to be within the accessible reach range. So definitely something to address. Dining areas. 5% of your dining areas need to be accessible. They need to be located on an accessible route. It also means that the dining surfaces have to be accessible. So typically the accessibility standards only address items and fixtures that are fixed. So because these tables are not fixed, somebody from the Access Board would say, well, you don't have to make those accessible because they're not fixed. Well, you're still providing the service of dining. So even though these tables aren't fixed, we need to figure out how can we provide at least 5% of our dining area that is wheelchair accessible for people that need the knee clearance, toe clearance, and top surface height to be accessible for them so that they can enjoy their meal without hot soup spilling in their lap from being too far away from the counter or the table. So, these types of tables, when they have the pedestals, those become an issue because there's not that clear floor space underneath it. Some of them are a little bit better with the pedestals that they provide that 30-inch clear floor space. So that would be something that to also address with any of the folks from CCA that might come out to survey. It doesn't mean that you have to change out all your tables. We're just looking at 5%. So maybe it means that you're offering kind of different types of tables. Maybe some are square with the pedestals, maybe some are round, different type options. Maybe you have some of the pedestals that once they're joined together will provide the clear floor space with that 30-inch width. But something to definitely look into. Toilet rooms, I'm going to say go look at the cute little video on the Access Board website so you can understand the clear floor spaces and turning spaces there. Definitely for restaurants in particular, probably one of the most challenging and also one of the most costly areas to make renovations to. But if you look at how patrons are coming into your business, it's definitely on a priority there to address, and preferably sooner than later. Other issues, drinking fountains. Signage, when not all of your entrances are accessible, you need to include signage indicating where the accessible entrance would be. This goes the same way with your restrooms. If not all of your restrooms are accessible, you would include signage indicating the direction and location of where the accessible restrooms are. So, all that. This is the nitty-gritty that I wanted to get to, is that there's a lot of information in the ADA standards and in the regulations, but I want you to recognize that that doesn't mean that there aren't resources available to help you. If I were working with a client, that I kind of tried to shorten this up, what are the top things that I would want to make sure that my client knew about where they could go in terms of making their business more accessible for people with disabilities? First and foremost is you can't fix what you don't know. So you need to assess and identify what barriers exist, what are the physical barriers, what are the communication barriers that exist for customers with disabilities. From that, we need to develop a barrier removal plan. What is our plan? And you know what? I work with dozens and dozens of municipalities all over the country. I've worked with the National Park Service for 20 years. You do not make something accessible overnight. It cannot be done. It requires planning, but without a plan, how does that say? We plan to fail when we fail to plan. So we need to have a plan. That plan also serves as your CYA document should somebody complain about your venue or business not being accessible. So if whether or not it's an ADA complaint with the Department of Justice or a lawsuit, you can say, well, this is what we've done so far. We've concentrated first on our parking and our entrance, and now, for FY17 or 18, we're going to look at the restroom renovation. But that is a great CYA document to show your good faith effort in complying with the ADA. Many times, any type of complaint can be alleviated by having staff that are adequately trained and have disability and sensitivity training. It's the same type of thing when you're providing customer service training to your staff, is making sure that you have a disability awareness component in it, that they understand how, if a person is visually impaired, ask them, is there an alternate format menu that you would like to use? Maybe you don't have one. You might ask, well, I could, read that to you if that would be okay with you, or train them to ask more questions, Are you more interested in a meat entree tonight or pasta? And that, instead of your staff feeling, oh, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes reading the menu, is train them to ask more questions about honing in on a specific item that they might have interest in. So doing that staff training can really help. I've seen many situations minimized because the staff did such a good job at providing good quality customer service. In terms of your action plan and your barrier removal, partner with a credible architect and contractor. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have seen plans that were not drawn accurately, that the expense could have been saved by having somebody independently review the plan in advance, or where a contractor thought that he knew what he was doing and didn't either follow the plan or the plan was wrong and the finished product was not accessible or not compliant with the standards. That can all be, you can save yourself a lot of time and expense by having an independent person review it and do an inspection prior to you signing off on the final project.
I just want to make sure everybody understands they've heard a number of different resources for finding out this information. Please don't rely on an independent contractor to design an accessible element.
That's right. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because there's two different things that, and the group that we met this morning, I gave this example is that I gave a presentation back around Christmas time to a group of contractors, and I told them that if in the bidding process they saw an error on the drawing where they were being told to do something that was not ADA compliant, I told them that they had a moral and ethical obligation to bring that to the owner's attention. And they said, no way are we going to do that. No, I mean, they flipped out at me. I didn't think I was going to get out of the door alive. And they said this contractors group, what they told me was, if they bring these issues to the owner in the bid process or afterwards, and the owner perceives that as costing more money, they're not going to get the job if it's bid out, or they're not going to get hired again for future jobs. So to rely solely on the contractor or solely on the architect or engineer to make sure that it's accessible, at this point in time, and no offense, but we're in Indiana and our building code is significantly behind when it comes to its compliance with the 2010 ADA standards. We simply cannot depend solely on those professionals. But if you do get a third independent review, I recommend that it's somebody that you're paying, that's their expertise. If you don't know that person, you can call me. I'll give you a list of people. I do it, but I have a list of other people that can do it as well. So review that plan and then have that job inspected before you pay the contractor. Make sure it is done correctly, because if it doesn't say so in your contract, it is very hard to get a contractor to come back and fix something that was already wrong on the plan. So make sure it is inspected, that you have somebody knowledgeable with the ADA standards to come out and make sure everything was done correctly. I see way too many renovations and new constructions that are not done correctly, simply because the plan wasn't right or the contractor didn't fully comply, and they can't be fixed now, and that it costs the owner money in the long run. When you're making your corrective actions, I recommend to people that they're keeping a record of all that. That's all your CYA documentation. Know that you're also eligible for federal disabled access tax credits and a tax deduction for your barrier removal under the ADA. And then once you have made those corrective actions to make your venue more accessible to people with disabilities, celebrate it, promote it, sing it from the highest rooftop. You know, it doesn't help if people have known for years and years and years the accessibility issues at Nix. I mean, I went to school here and I knew what they were before I knew anything about the ADA. But when you make those improvements, make sure people know, because that's your free advertising to people to say, hey, you know, what you've known for 20 or 30 years now is accessible. It's open, available to a whole new audience of people to come in and enjoy and partake in. And when word gets out, you know, people aren't just coming because, you know, the food is good or the IU game is on. They're coming because it's accessible, and it's just opening up your doors to a lot more patrons to come in. So make sure and promote it. We were talking this morning about other ways that the CCA can help you cross-promote your accessibility improvements as well. Your resources, because I'm way over my time now. First and foremost, 800-949-4232. That is the Great Lakes ADA Center. They are my go-to folks for the ADA compliance, whether or not it's on policy procedure issues or the standards in and of themselves. My second go-to is the U.S. Access Board. That's the federal designated agency that writes the accessibility standards. They have staff that are on their 800 line Monday through Friday that know the standards inside and out. The Department of Justice has an ADA website, ada.gov. That is where you can get the ADA regulations themselves. They have several technical assistance guidance areas, guidance publications on there. They also have their settlement agreements. And I can tell you all these, you know, warm, fuzzy things about how good it is to include people with disabilities and make your business more accessible, but when it comes down to it, I use the ada.gov website as a best example of not what you don't want to be, the business that you don't want to be, because all of their settlement agreements with Friendly's Restaurant, Yankee Stadium, Netflix, Blockbuster, Macy's, they're all on the DOJ website. You don't want to be one of them. You don't want to see a settlement agreement with DOJ be up there. So learn from the people that have gone before you about, you know, if a complaint were filed, and complaints have been filed against all of the biggest chains between hotels, movie theaters, restaurants. They've all, you know, been there, done that. We're 26 years into the ADA. You can see all of the examples of what, when DOJ has to settle with you, they like to get a lot more out of you than, like, you know, than what you would typically do if you just proactively did it on your timeline and not theirs. But it's a great website to go to for that technical assistance information. And then what we haven't really talked about today, but know that because Title I deals with employment and employing people with disabilities, there is a section of the EEOC website specific to disability and disability law and what you as an employer should be doing in terms of making sure that you're making reasonable accommodations for your employees. So, I've talked really fast.
We probably have time for maybe like one burning question, because we want to get into the panel where you're going to be able to answer lots of questions. But any technical question for Jennifer?
Okay.
Great,
All right.
you did a great job. There you go. Thank you so much.